The night the comet returned, the sky above the cove split open like a ripe pomegranate, spilling garnet fire across the black satin of the cosmos, and every soul who had ever loved and lost stood barefoot on the sand, hands lifted in wordless welcome, feeling the tide pull at their ankles as though the moon itself leaned closer to listen. Speech balloon. Please leave your thoughts and analysis requests in the comments section. Sparkles. Thumbs up, likes and bell subscribes will help us make our work even more exciting. Rainbow sparkling heart. Your support is our greatest strength. Cherry blossom wave glowing star. In the oldest cottage, where the hearthstones still held the scent of cinnamon from 100 winter nights, a woman named Leela traced her fingertip over a photograph whose emulsion had bubbled and cracked like sun-baked earth, the image of a sailor whose eyes held the same storm-tossed green as the comet's nucleus now arcing overhead, and she whispered a vow she had whispered every year for 4 decades, that she would wait until the sea gave him back, even if the sea had no memory of the gifts it took. Down the cliff path, past the cairns of mussel shells left by children who believed the dead could hear the ocean through such fragile trumpets, a boy named Rowan carried a violin case older than himself, its leather scarred by salt and sorrow, and inside lay strings that had once belonged to his grandmother, the concertmistress whose final encore had been played while the hospital lights flickered like dying stars, and tonight he intended to tune those strings beneath the comet's glow so that the notes would rise and braid with the light and maybe, just maybe, teach the sky how to sing goodbye. Behind the lighthouse, whose beam swept the horizon like a slow, deliberate heartbeat, the keeper's daughter, Mira, pressed a camellia between pages of a logbook already swollen with pressed flowers, each marking a ship that had passed without incident and a night she had not slept, and she wondered if the comet could see the tiny white bloom she offered, whether such a traveler of centuries could spare a thought for the brief, trembling life of a single coastal blossom. Between the dunes, where the wind carved new valleys every hour and erased footprints before love could follow them home, a dog with one brown eye and one blue barked at the sky, not in fear but in recognition, because the last time this light had crossed the firmament he had been a pup curled against his first master's chest, and now he was old and grey but the light remembered him, stroking his fur with the same gentle fire that had once warmed a newborn's dreams. In the village square, under the plane tree whose leaves murmured like a congregation, an elderly baker named Etienne set out loaves shaped like spirals and crescents, the crusts gleaming with egg wash and stardust. He had climbed the roof at dusk and scattered sugar across the tiles so the comet's reflection would have something sweet to taste, and as the villagers arrived, drawn by the scent of cardamom and memory, each tore a piece and tasted the year they had fallen in love or the year they had almost left but stayed. Beside the fountain, where bronze dolphins spat arcs of water that caught and fractured the comet's crimson, a teenage girl named Soraya unfolded a letter her mother had written the night she was born. The ink faded to violet, and every sentence was a promise that the world would be wide enough for wonder, and Soraya read it aloud though her mother could no longer speak, her voice weaving through the water music until the dolphins themselves seemed to listen with tilted heads. At the edge of the pier, where barnacles clung like tiny grey roses to every plank, a fisherman named Cal tightened the knot in his net, the same knot his father had taught him and his father. Before that, and he cast the net not into the water but into the air, letting it billow like a lace curtain against the comet's glare, and for one impossible moment the mesh caught fragments of light, tiny emeralds wriggling like fish, before they slipped through and returned to the sky, leaving the twine warm in his palms. In the bell tower, whose bronze throat had not rung since the war when one side melted the bells for bullets, a stonemason named Luca laid his chisel against the new bell commissioned to sing again at the comet's passing, and as he carved the names of the lost, soldiers, sisters, strangers, into the metal, the shavings curled like silver petals that drifted down the spiral stairs and settled in corners where spiders would weave them into webs luminous with remembrance. Across the bay, in the derelict mansion where ivy had replaced wallpaper and owls nested in crystal chandeliers, a poet named Celeste dipped her quill into ink mixed with crushed amethyst and her own tears, writing verses on the cracked ballroom floor so that anyone who waltzed there centuries from now would feel the rhythm of her longing, and the comet's light poured through the broken dome like a spotlight on a stage where ghosts rehearsed their unfinished stories. Along the tide line, where jellyfish pulsed like glass hearts and the sand was littered with shards of sea glass polished to cloudy gems, a boy named Jonah collected every piece that caught the comet's glow, slipping them into a jar already half full of earlier storms, and he planned to bury the jar beneath the rosebush his mother had planted the day she learned she was pregnant, so that when the bush bloomed next spring the petals would carry the ocean's secrets and the sky's fire in their veins. Inside the abandoned cinema, where velvet seats sagged like tired soldiers and the projector's reels had fused into rusted donuts, a woman named Ingrid threaded new film through the gate, the Super 8 reel she had discovered in her grandfather's attic labeled simply, Summer 1910, and as the comet's light seeped through the torn roof she cranked the projector by hand, letting the flickering images of long-dead swimmers splash across the mildewed screen like ghosts learning how to drown all over again. On the rooftop garden, where tomatoes hung like miniature suns and basil released perfume with every breeze, a widower named Gus sprinkled ash from his wife's favorite book around the roots of the lemon tree she had grown from seed, and he spoke to the tree as though it were her, recounting how the comet had first appeared on the night they met, how she had laughed at the idea that a rock could carry love across millennia, and how now he believed it had simply been early, arriving at last to collect what had always been hers. beneath the aqueduct, whose arches framed the comet like a portal, a group of travelers from distant continents shared bread and stories in a dozen languages, the crusts broken by hands that had once held rifles and now held children, and as the light shifted from red to gold to violet, each saw in the sky the outline of their homeland, an olive grove, a mountain peak, a river delta, and understood that exile could be beautiful if shared beneath a sky generous enough to mirror every longing at once. In the apiary, where bees slept in clustered constellations of their own, an elderly beekeeper named Rosa opened the hives and let the comet's glow settle on the wings of her oldest queen, a monarch who had survived drought and flood and whose honey tasted faintly of the lavender fields that no longer existed, and Rosa whispered that the next harvest would be of starlight, thick and luminous, and she would seal it in jars etched with the names of everyone who had ever tasted sweetness on her porch. Behind the monastery walls, where monks had once copied manuscripts by candlelight until their fingers bled ink, a novice named Brother Anselm lit a single beeswax candle and placed it in the window of the scriptorium, illuminating a page where he had spent 7 years illuminating the letter L with lapis and gold leaf so pure it caught the comet's reflection and threw it back magnified, so that anyone passing on the road below would see not just light but language, a single letter burning with the weight of love. Along the railway track, whose rails had rusted into ribbons of iron oxide, a retired engineer named May walked the ties counting every sleeper she had once laid by hand, her fingers remembering the weight of each spike, and at the center of the longest bridge she balanced a coin on the rail, a coin minted the year her daughter was born, and waited for the comet to strike it with light so fierce the metal would remember and carry the memory forward on phantom trains that would never derail. In the butterfly conservatory, where glass panes dripped with condensation and orchids grew from the air itself, a lepidopterist named Felix coaxed a rare atlas moth to perch on his wrist, its wingspan wider than his palm, and as the comet's rays filtered through the glass the moth's wings turned translucent, revealing maps of constellations etched in scales, and Felix understood that migration was just another word for devotion, every journey a love letter written across the sky. Beside the river, where willows trailed fingers in the current and dragonflies stitched seams of light between reeds, a potter named Celine shaped a bowl from clay she had dug near her grandmother's grave, and while the wheels spun she sang the lullabies her grandmother had sung to her, the clay rising and falling like a chest breathing, and when the bowl was leather hard she carved the comet's trajectory along its rim so that every soup or sorrow it held afterward would carry a taste of celestial fire. On the cliff's edge, where gulls wheeled like scraps of prayer and the drop was sheer enough to make the heart stutter, a man named Dorian released a paper lantern whose sides were painted with the faces of everyone he had failed to love well, and as the lantern rose the comet's light ignited the rice paper so that the faces burned bright and brief before the ash scattered, and Dorian felt the failures lift from his shoulders like birds finally allowed to migrate. In the underground cavern, where stalactites dripped in geological rhythm and blind fish navigated by heartbeat, a spelunker named Cass discovered a vein of crystal so clear it mirrored the comet's passage though no sky was visible, and she pressed her forehead to the crystal and saw not reflection but memory, her own birth, her mother's last breath, the moment she first understood solitude, and the crystal held each image like a tear that refused to fall. At the observatory, whose dome had not opened since the budget cuts, an astronomer named Drive Arjun pried the rusted shutters apart with a crowbar, the metal screaming like gulls, and when the telescope finally aligned he saw not the comet but the ghost image of his wife who had died the year funding was denied, her silhouette outlined in ionized gas, and he realized the universe had not forgotten her but had instead been storing her light for this precise return. In the vineyard, where grapes hung heavy with the sugar of a long hot summer, vintners named Luis and Marta harvested by moonlight, their knives flashing like comet tails, and each cluster they placed in the press was accompanied by a story, how their son had learned to walk between these rows, how the soil tasted of iron and longing, how the wine would be bottled and labeled with the comet's name so that future dinners would remember this night when the sky bled into the earth. Beneath the quilt of stars, where the Milky Way spilled like milk across velvet, children too young to know the word nostalgia chased fireflies and shouted that they had caught pieces of the comet, and their parents, lounging on blankets, let the lie stand because wonder was more important than accuracy, and each jar of flickering insects became a portable galaxy to set beside their beds where dreams could borrow light. In the abandoned amusement park, where Ferris wheel seats swung like empty cradles and carousel horses grinned with paint peeling like sunburnt skin, a street artist named Zara spray painted a mural across the ticket booth, lovers kissing while the comet streaked above, their bodies outlined in phosphorescent green that glowed even when the park lights failed, and she signed the mural with her grandmother's name because art belonged to the dead as much as the living. Along the seawall, where graffiti spelled out every kind of heartbreak in every human language, a sailor named Nico carved a single word into the concrete, return, and he filled the grooves with melted gold leaf stolen from a church icon, knowing the sea would eventually claim the wall but hoping the word would remain legible to anyone who, like him, had watched the horizon for a ship that never came until the comet itself became the vessel carrying every farewell back home. In the candlelit kitchen, where cast iron pots hung like planets and the cat purred on the windowsill, a grandmother named Dolores stirred chocolate and chili over a flame so low it barely existed, the recipe older than the village, and she told her granddaughter that the comet had once been a woman who loved too fiercely and was turned to fire for it, and the chocolate was thick enough to coat every tongue that ever tasted regret and turn it to sweetness. On the balcony, where Jasmine climbed the iron railing and released perfume only at night, a pianist named Elise played Satie's Gymnopédie No. 1 with the sustained pedal pressed so long the notes bled into each other like watercolors, and as the comet passed overhead the music rose to meet it, each chord a stepping stone across the dark, and neighbors leaned out their windows not to listen but to breathe. In the attic, where trunks exhaled dust and moth wings, a historian named Victor unfolded a dress yellowed with age, its lace as delicate as memory, and he recognized it from the photograph of his great-aunt who had danced once beneath the comet's previous visit and then vanished, and he placed the dress on a mannequin beneath the skylight so the light could fill the empty sleeves, and for one moment she danced again, spinning without feet. Beneath the fig tree, whose roots cracked the cemetery wall and whose fruit fed both the living and the worms, a gravedigger named Sam planted a cutting from his mother's garden right between two headstones, and he whispered to the dead that the figs would be sweet this year, sweetened by the comet's fire, and anyone who ate them would taste both the earth and the sky, the bitterness and the sugar. In the library, where the smell of vellum and vanilla lingered like an old lover's perfume, a translator named Hannah worked by candlelight on a manuscript found sealed in the wall, love poems written in a language no one spoke anymore, and she translated not with dictionaries but with tears, each word chosen by how it tasted when spoken aloud, and when the comet's light slid across the page the letters rearranged themselves into her own name, which she had never told anyone. At the edge of the marsh, where reeds rattled like bones and frogs sang in baritone, a botanist named Theo discovered a new species of orchid. Blooming only under comet light, its petals black as obsidian and veined with silver, and he named it after his partner who had died the previous winter, pressing one bloom between microscope slides so that even when the flower vanished the name would remain, a constellation spelled in Latin. In the subway tunnel, where trains no longer ran and murals depicted every revolution that had failed, a violinist named Luca played Bach's Chaconne while rats paused mid-scurry to listen, and the comet's reflection in a puddle became a spotlight no city could afford, and commuters who had taken the wrong turn found themselves weeping on the tracks, not from despair but from the sudden certainty that beauty could survive abandonment. On the hospital roof, where IV poles stood like metal scarecrows and the night smelled of antiseptic and lilacs, a nurse named Amara released biodegradable balloons filled with messages from patients too weak to stand, each balloon a color chosen by the person who wrote the message inside, and as the comet passed the balloons ignited one by one, becoming brief stars that carried secrets like, I forgive you, and, please remember the sound of my laugh. In the desert, where the sand was so white it reflected the comet twice, a caravan of travelers circled their camels and built a fire of dried rose stems that smelled like tea and longing, and they passed a single cup filled with water and pomegranate seeds, each person sipping and spitting a seed into the flames so the fire would remember their stories long after they scattered. Beneath the opera house, where costumes hung like flayed skins and music still echoed in the velvet folds, a seamstress named Inez embroidered the comet's tail onto the hem of a wedding dress commissioned but never worn, and she stitched with thread spun from her own hair so the dress would carry her DNA into whatever future bride dared wear it, walking down an aisle of starlight. In the greenhouse, where tomatoes grew heart-shaped and the air was thick with basil breath, a widower named Diego grafted a rose onto a potato root so the bloom would feed the earth while it opened, and he placed the pot on the windowsill so the comet could pollinate it with fire, the petals unfolding like pages of a book no one had thought to write. Along the fault line, where the earth had cracked and healed and cracked again, a geologist named Petra pressed her ear to the ground and heard the comet's approach not through sound but through vibration, the tectonic plates humming like a cello string, and she understood that even stone sang when love passed overhead, even granite remembered being lava. In the orphanage, where beds were lined like dominoes and lullabies were sung in rounds, a volunteer named Omar taught the children to fold paper boats and set them alight with candles, launching them on the reflecting pool so the burning fleet became a mirror of the sky, and each child whispered a wish to the flames, some for parents, some for puppies, one for the comet to take her to the moon where no one was ever lonely. On the mountain pass, where the air was thin enough to make thoughts transparent, a shepherd named Anya milked her goats by starlight and spoke to them in the language her mother had used, a tongue of clicks and sighs, and the goats' eyes reflected the comet so that each udder released milk the color of moonlight, sweet with the herbs of high altitude and grief. In the abandoned cathedral, whose stained glass saints had lost their faces to time and war, a glassblower named Renato fused new panes from beach sand and comet ash, creating saints whose halos were made of the same fire that now streaked across the sky, and when the morning sun struck the glass the entire nave filled with rainbowed light so intense the pigeons roosting in the rafters took flight like prayers finally answered. Beneath the banyan tree, whose aerial roots formed a cathedral of wood, a storyteller named Asher began a tale that would last all night, each branch a chapter, each leaf a character, and the comet became the hero who traveled not through space but through every listener's heart, collecting the brightest and darkest pieces to string into a necklace that would one day be flung back across the sky as the next constellation.